time. I'm very happy that it's been recognized with the support and various forums like this that it's received so far. I'm just going to take no more than 2 minutes just to reflect on the, like Professor Vivian said, on the significance of it. So you'll hear from Gabe in a minute. Chinese people have lived in Kern since 1857. As you know, or as you may know, that's only 7 years after statehood was granted to California, which historian Manu Karuka says was still in some sense an overseas possession of the United States. What do you think? 1857 also coincides with the earliest possible point Kevin McCarthy's great-grandparents could have arrived in Kern. It's also 8 decades before the Dust Bowl, the time in which many non-native inhabitants of Kern trace their origins. It's also about 50 years older than the idea of China as a modern nation state, and 92 years older than the current government of China. By the end of the 19th century, you'll also hear in a minute, Chinese people were as much as 12% of the population of Kern County. So ask yourself, are 12% of the facts you've learned about Bakersfield and Kern 100 years ago something related to the Chinese community, and also are the existing facts accurate? Memory, generally lacks parity with reality here, and I think the intellectual reasons for that are pretty clear. We've found only 2 non-academic sources and 0 academic sources published about the history of the Chinese in Kern so far. One of the 2 existing sources is a book produced by the community itself. Thinking, or as we listen and think about this more, I think there are 3 lessons I would mention that are worth keeping in mind from scholarship on Chinese America generally. Right? First, in the 19th century, it was really strikingly normal for large numbers of people from one part of the world to move to another part of the world, great distances, to interact across, conventionally defined geographic and communal boundaries, and also to exhibit belonging in multiple places. Second, despite being normal, it was not easy. But also saying that it wasn't easy doesn't simply mean that Chinese people succeeded in preserving their culture against adversity, right? It's actually, it goes deeper than that. The adversities of modern immigration shaped modern ideas of identity. Third, racist or misleading narratives such as model minority, melting pot, nation of immigrants, and I would also add the idea of minority contribution to a society that's still otherwise conceived in majoritarian terms obscures the variety and the complexity and the painfulness frequently of these histories. So Gabe's research, that's just what I take, some of what I take from the scholarship generally. Gabe's research echoes those findings and also adds new perspectives by showing us, again, that rural America was also diverse.
So, hello everybody. My name is Gabe Moore and I'm a history major here at CSUB. And for the past year, I have been researching the local Chinese community in Kern County's history. So the topic that I was first drawn to upon hearing, or the reason I was drawn to this research was because I had first heard about Bakersfield having 2 Chinatowns at one period. And that was kind of what got me started looking into this history. So when we think of Chinatowns, our minds are kind of immediately drawn to our own modern conception of what a Chinatown is and our own experiences visiting Chinatowns. So, for example, here in San Francisco or Los Angeles. Both of these have easily recognizable Chinatowns, distinguished by their architecture emulating the Ming and Qing style, or Ming and Qing eras in China's history. And also their statues and monuments and shops and restaurants that appeal to the visitors that come to them. So taking this into consideration, it's easy for us to imagine Bakersfield's Chinatowns took a similar shape and fashion, but that is not necessarily the case. So this here is the first depiction of Bakersfield's Chinatown coming from 1882. This image was released in Harper's New Monthly magazine And as we can see, the rendering is far from our modern idea of what Chinatowns are. So keeping that in mind, let's go back to the earliest history of the Chinese individuals in Kern County. So Chinese individuals first started coming to California in the 1840s. This was during the Qing Dynasty, not necessarily what China is now today. So amidst their immigration here back in China, there were clan wars going on, there was the Taiping Rebellion, the Opium Wars with Britain, and natural disasters and famine. During the same period, the gold rush was going on in California, making it an appealing spot for immigrants all over the world to come to our state. So gold would be discovered in the Kern River the first time in 1854, as you can see on this top article. The miners had to gather together and determine that Chinese individuals were not allowed to come to the Kern River. That would now be reversed until 1857 on the bottom article, where it was decided that Chinese individuals could come to Kern County and mine so long as come to the Kern River and mine so long as they were contracted by the white miners themselves. So in 1864, the town of Havilah in the Kern Canyon would be founded. When Kern County was first incorporated in 1866, it became the county seat. And the first so-called Chinatown that we would have would likely come from in Havilah, where individual named Sam Singh owned a 3-acre property where he did some farming. And on the census, you have Chinese individuals all listed right next to him, showing that they are living within a close area of him. And then by 1870, there were 142 Chinese individuals living in Kern County of the 2,925 on the census. So, in 1872, the county seat would be moved to Bakersfield. As the town grew, so did the size of the Chinese population. Secondary sources claim that Chinese individuals in Bakersfield had obtained their land from the town's namesake, Thomas Baker, for work that they had done for him, and as payment, he would give them lands. In 1875, Bakersfield's newspaper used the term Chinatown for the first time, and by 1880, more than 200 individuals born in China would call it home. Most of these structures in Bakersfield's Chinatown were made of wood and referred to as shanties, and were actually quite susceptible to fires. Let's see. And then this is a 1885 Sanborn fire map that shows Chinatown distinctly being listed. By the mid-1880s, Kern County's Chinese population was rising because of the region's need for laborers in both railroad construction and in the agricultural sector. But as they were expanding, Chinatown had a limitation of how much it could expand itself. In 1889, a strife within the Chinese community itself had arisen between two different Chinese district associations known as the Sanyup and the Sayup. The group of immigrants together by what regions in China they had come from, kind of keeping people together with their clan ties and so forth back in the homeland. And then this strife in 1889 and the rise of the population would lead to the expansion of the new Chinatown, which Dr. Lewis S. Roger helped build on Q Street and between 17th and 18th Street. So he built up some properties for them and started renting out to the Chinese individuals, and that would come into fruition in 1893. In addition to the large numbers of Chinese individuals living within the Chinatowns, many other local Chinese would live on the railroad sites where they were working, or on the ranches and orchards in which they were working. Although what has been discussed is just a brief history of the origins of Bakersfield's Chinatowns, I think it is more important that we now shift our focus to the forms of discrimination the Chinese community had faced during this period. The most obvious forms of discrimination would come at the state and federal levels. In 1850, the same year that California was granted statehood, it had passed in its legislation a foreign miners tax, which was predominantly enforced on Chinese and Latino miners. And It has been estimated that roughly 10% of the state's total revenues from 1853 to 1864 were because of this foreign miners tax. Another highly consequential state law would come over 60 years later in 1913 with the Alien Land Law, which prevented Asians from purchasing land and renting land in California. Now, the federal level, we have the first form of legislation coming in 1875 with the Page Act. So the Page Act restricted Chinese women from entering the country under the assumption that many were coming for, and I quote, lewd and immoral purposes. And then 7 years after the Page Act, we would have an even broader ban, and this would come through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted nearly all Chinese immigration to the United States, with only a few exceptions. These discriminatory state and federal policies have been highly researched, but the same cannot be said for the discrimination at the Kern County level. In 1886, Kern County had an anti-Chinese meeting where there were attempts to establish a committee on Chinatown to monitor the properties in the Chinese community. In addition to that, 7 years later, amidst the panic of 1893, a global financial panic, there were numerous anti-Chinese meetings held in Kern County, and a line of communication was even established between the local district attorney's office and the United States Assistant District Attorney in Los Angeles, with the hopes of having Chinese individuals deported under the Geary Law. Local discrimination continued as seen by the large numbers of local public officials who attended a 1901 convention for the reenactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which included notable figures named Henry Jastrow and Truxton Beale. So as you can see, each of these charts has two meetings. So 1893, that was our local Chinese meeting. I put down some notable members. We have the Assistant District Attorney, Justice of Peace, and the School Trustee, and then a couple of real estate, people involved in the real estate. And then in 1901, we have the Chinese Exclusion Conference, which was held in San Francisco. And then yet again, just a couple of the notable names that were at that conference. The one correlating name, E.J. Emmons, he became a state senator by that time. And then we also have our district attorney, Henry Jastrow, which was the Board of Supervisors, and then Truxton Beale, the owner of the Tahone Ranch at the time. Beale even took it a step further a year after this 1901 conference and published a 6-page article titled, Why the Chinese Should Be Excluded, where he depicts the Chinese as a threat to civilization and even states, as I quote, the Chinese have no place in our social systems, and that the highest forms of government require the highest races of people. So at the same time that was going on, we also have we also see discrimination through the biggest employer of Chinese individuals within the region, the Kern County Land Company. And at this time, they were taking deliberate efforts to advertise their available lands to predominantly white markets. This can be seen through the fact that they had land offices in Chicago, New York, Bakersfield, but in addition to that, also in London, and they were publishing, they published at least one material in the German language for distribution. Let's see. In addition to this, promotional materials often, like within these promotional materials that the Kern County Land Company was producing, they often referred to the Chinese community as a ready-to-use workforce that new settlers could take advantage of. In said materials, Chinese labor is listed at a cost of between 75 cents and $1 a day, as opposed to their white counterparts, which is listed between $1 and $1.25 a day. Now, the Kern County Land Company listed its lands at a cost of $60 to $100 an acre and typically sold them in 20-acre plots and required a down payment of 1/4 of the total cost of the property. On the low end, this would be roughly $300 in that time period. And considering the company is selling the land, the same company that's selling this land is paying its own Chinese workforce only $25 a month. So this creates a pretty impossible amount of money to save in order for Chinese individuals to purchase land through the same company that they're working for. And then this document right here that I have listed is actually a labor contract between the founder of the Kern County Land Company, James Ben Ali Hagan, and it's for him contracting out 50 Chinese laborers in Kern County starting in 1881. So the impact of this could like really be seen by the time you get to the 1900 federal census, where we find that only 3% of the Chinese population in Kern County owned property, which is quite less than the 11.5% that the white population would own of their own property. So, and then adding insult to injury, in 1903, Henry Jastrow, who was a supporter of Chinese exclusion despite being an immigrant himself, was named the general manager of the Kern County Land Company. So when you take into account the financial hardships that would be for Chinese individuals to obtain land, even if they were able to get to that point, they would still have to deal with the head of the Kern County Land Company being an advocate for Chinese exclusion and attending those conferences, and also the local real estate agents that were attending those conferences as well. So now to this point, we've discussed the early origins and conditions of our local Chinatowns, but the discrimination the Chinese community faced at the federal, state, and local levels had a pretty big impact on the Chinese community and their future within Kern County. These compounding factors had a significant impact, and if we look at this graph here, we can see just how that played out in the population. So through the years 1870 to 1920, we have our Chinese community listed. It went from being roughly 5% of the population to skyrocketing to 12.5%, then 11.5%, dwindling back down to 5%, and then by 1920, it only accounted for 1% of Kern County's total population. So, with the Chinese population dwindling and the city continually growing, it should come as a little surprise that our local Chinatowns would slowly disappear. By the 1940s, only a few remaining Chinese businesses and structures and residences occupied the once lively Chinatown districts, and most of these remaining structures would be dealt their final blow by the 1952 earthquake that devastated downtown Bakersfield. 2 years after this earthquake, Bakersfield, California recalled the event, and it claimed that the event had opened the opportunity for Bakersfield to become more of a modern city. And they quote, as they said, as I quote, "A big percentage of the old eyesores were gone, including the old Skid Row, which was nearly wiped out." Now, although the 1952 earthquake may have been accredited for, or may be accredited for dealing the final blow to the Chinatowns as we know them, that does not mean that the Chinese community fell out of existence here in Kern County, and neither did their impact. And this notion can really be seen through an individual that many of you may not have heard of, named Eugene Kin Choi. So Eugene was born in China in 1912, and at the age of 10, him and his family came to Bakersfield. He attended Kern County Union High School, which is now VHS, and Bakersfield College, and at both of these schools he was recognized for his aptitude in architecture. He would go on to USC in 1930 and graduate from there in 1939, which was just the second Chinese individual to graduate from USC in their architecture program. And he was also just the second Chinese American architect to join the American Institute of Architects. Eugene is remembered for his work in Los Angeles' Chinatown, and then also for breaking down racial barriers in Silver Lake. When he moved to Silver Lake, he had to go door to door asking for permission to build his family's house in the neighborhood. As for his work in Bakersfield, Eugene designed the Let Sing Gong Temple, which was built in 1951 on our street. Not only did this temple survive the 1952 earthquake, but it also still stands today. And although it is often overlooked, it serves as a reminder of the impacts that our local Chinese community has had on our history. Thank you.
for Gabriel until after we're done with the second lecture. Hi. Can you guys hear me, or should I get this? Okay. So hi, my name is Eileen Diaz. Like Dr. Megan said, I'm a master's student here at CSUB for the history program. I'm also a commissioner for the City of Bakersfield Historic Preservation Commission. I wear a lot of hats, but here, just speaking as a student researcher capacity, right? So my presentation will be on community organizing and self-reliance in Sunset Mayflower District, specifically from the 1930s to the 1940s. My colleague Donato will talk about a little bit after that, kind of going into this as well. So like I said, my research is primarily focused on the 1930s and 40s, but does address some aspects of the area's history leading into the 1950s and also early into the 1880s. And today I'll be discussing the importance of community organizing in that area. So to start, the Sunset Mayflower District is located in southeast Bakersfield and is comprised of the Sunset Tract and Mayflower Addition. The Sunset Tract was established in 1910 and the Mayflower Addition in 1911. And I know sometimes it can be kind of hard to visualize exactly where these areas are in Bakersfield. I know a lot of us probably don't come from that area. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a map that hopefully you can see. I've been working on from the summer to now. So let's see a little bit, but in terms of downtown Bakersfield is right here, and the Sunset Mayflower District resides in this area. I initially created this map as a way to help me visualize for my research just exactly where this area is. I've driven through it countless times, but it's still hard to kind of visualize just how far this area is from resources that are available to other parts of the city. So this was kind of, like I said, just to visualize, and we kind of went a little crazy, Donato and I and the HRC, with kind of just trying to identify these areas. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. This right here in the purple is the Sunset Mayflower District, as I will be referring to it in this presentation. Here is the Mayflower Addition, again established in 1911, and the Sunset Tract in 1910. I also wanted to point out the public transportation routes that did not service the area until much later. So it kind of just this map, I love it because it helps me visualize, kind of helps me track just again how far these areas are from those resources, also how far away they were from government investment. These markers in green are WPA projects that are unsurprisingly located very far from southeast Bakersfield. I also wanted to point out just how close it is to the sanitation district. So you can imagine living very close to where all your waste goes and how unpleasant that can be, and just how it was strategically placed in that area. Although there was community organization efforts to keep it out, as well as a junkyard. So the areas I will highlight in this presentation will be primarily the Sunset Mayflower District and the area of Carversville, Crystal Heights, which is located just a little more south on Cottonwood Road. Let's go back to this. Is that good? Yeah. So the issues to address, the area was inundated with a lot of problems regarding residents' basic needs, roads and transportation, juvenile delinquency, housing, streetlights, and infrastructure. And this is also a result of the larger issues happening in the greater Bakersfield area, having to do with policing, a lack of representation of communities of color in the city and county governments, inequality in education, and the racial attitudes at the time. There also, in terms of policing, was a general mistrust of law enforcement by communities of color, largely due to the injustices many have faced, but we'll get into this later. Schools which service the Sunset Mayflower district were so vastly underfunded in comparison to schools that serve primarily white children, white families. And a lack of representation and a desire for change in the municipal government resulted in the mobilization of grassroots efforts geared towards self-determination and advancement of the area for its community members. Through this mobilization toward grassroots organization, the SMPC was formed, and so I'm going to start getting into that weird.
Make sure this we're good. Okay, so this presentation I've titled "America's Newest City," and you see some parallels with Gabe's research with the eliminating of the Chinatowns in 1954. So I'll mention that briefly to make that connection. So this I kind of want to just start to show like the conditions of housing. And then there's a photograph that I found in my research that says no color traits solicited. For a lot of research for Bakersfield is finding these types of imageries, right? And these aren't very common to find. I've talked to other historians like Dr. Oliver Rosales, Javier Llamas from Bakersfield College, and this is like the only photograph that I know that exists. So just to show, many of us have conversations about segregation, racial attitudes, and the existence of the past. And it's to show that these signs do exist, but in some cases, sometimes we don't collect them enough, or we don't give them enough value to collect them as well. So just to show that. So I'm going to define redlining. So this is the new term of redlining, and I'll kind of backtrack in the slides to define what redlining used to mean. So and this is a definition by the New York Times by Candace Jackson. It says, quote, "In recent years, the term redlining has become shorthand for many types of historic race-based exclusionary tactics in real estate, from racial steering." So racial steering is when you're trying to buy a home and someone says, "Wouldn't you like this home better?" Or, people speak your language in this neighborhood, "Wouldn't you like to live there?" And that's actually illegal. So from here, we're going to by real estate agents directing Black home buyers and renters to certain neighborhoods or buildings and away from others, to racial covenants, and that I'll talk about later. And many suburb developments barring Black residents from buying homes, all of which contributed to racial segregation that shaped the way America looks today. And this also included Hispanics and other racial minority groups. So the first two slides will kind of cover the conditions of housing. So this one, I won't really speak much about it, but this is from a report from 1930 by the then Governor C.C. Young, where they did a fact-finding mission on the conditions of Mexican housing. And here up top, you'll see Bakersfield is listed. So here they sent a survey to 47 cities, of which 24 replied that they had segregated Mexican districts. Bakersfield's on that list. So in here in the fact-finding committee, they outlined some of the barriers, and they talked about racially restrictive covenants, which were agreements that barred certain people from buying homes. And here you see that they exclusively kept homes for the Caucasian race, and in some cases excluded Mexicans specifically. And here is a narrative from the 1950s from the Crisis magazine, and this is a report from the NAACP here locally that sent a letter to the regional office in San Francisco. This letter later became an article in the Crisis magazine where they depict the conditions, the living conditions of the Mayflower Sunset neighborhood that Eileen spoke about. So in here, the headers in the quote, it says, "In all my experience of an NAACP worker through the Deep South, I have never seen as dreadful, unsanitary, and depressing as those under which thousands of Negro migrant workers have to live on the outskirts of Bakersfield. There are no sanitary facilities whatsoever, but people having to use pit toilets whose stench is readily recognizable miles away." And these are homes from the Mayflower Sunset District. I think specifically they're identified on Cottonwood Road. And these are photographs from the Kern County Museum. So now I'll talk about transitioning into federal home loan programs. This is coming after the New Deal, after the Great Depression, or in the Great Depression. And these programs were created to alleviate the large amount of foreclosures. And I'll talk about some of the race influence that they had. So the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, is created during the New Deal, and then the HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation. and these were created to boost homeownership. So the HOLC, the FHA, create a value grading system, of which this is part of the older definition of redlining. So who here has seen redlining maps, or at least heard of them? Right, so Fresno has one, we can see right here. And this is their grading system. So A is the green, the best, and so on to red. Red most often meant communities of color. So Bakersfield is cited as not having a map, and it's not because these practices weren't here. It's to say that just Bakersfield didn't have a large enough population for them to make a map. So what I have here is an example of evaluation. And evaluation did things like look at civic and community centers. Do you have a hospital nearby? Do you have good schools nearby? Things that often weren't really invested in communities of color, right? So often we, communities of color got the lowest grade, right? So this is a grading sheet from the FHA in East Bakersfield. So you can see how the definition of redlining has changed as research has gone on. So now I'm going to get into racially restricted covenants. So the FHA in 1938, in their underwriting manual, the underwriting manual is what real estate agents use to kind of build on their practice of selling homes. It was kind of their, how do you sell, who do you sell to, how do you set value, how do you do contracts. So in that underwriting manual, we can see here in G, they tell real estate agents to have race restrictions, says prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. And this is what they're teaching real estate agents in 1938. So in here I have language from Bakersfield, and this is pretty similar throughout a lot of these properties. I'll show you a big map. So I only have one example, but we've mapped it now. So here it says, no part of property shall be used or occupied or permitted or to be occupied by any person not of the white or Caucasian race, except for such persons as are engaged in bona fide domestic employment of the owner thereof or those holding under said owner. So I got some parallel with what Eileen said about communities of color going into other communities and providing labor. So since 1938, they recommended this. Before 1938, we have to kind of look at what rights restrictions look like. So we can here see the Bakersfield Realty and Building Companies organized, and there they also recommend race restrictions, right? That they're gonna racially restrict neighborhoods. And here's a grant deed from 1924, and in I don't have the language specifically from the grant deed, but this is the quotes. And it says, the lands herein conveyed shall never at any time be sold or rented or to occupy any person not of the white or Caucasian race. So the historian Paige Glaucher outlines that the National Association of Real Estate Boards kind of established this practice in the late 1800s. And by the time the FHA and HOLC are formed, they're tapping into these groups to establish these practices. So and her argument is that these things aren't necessarily unique because they're getting this from people who are already doing it, right? So, but the FHA is transformative since we have the standardization of the home loan, access to home loans. This creates a much wider segregation amongst American cities. So we have the role of the real estate agent, and this is actually written into their code of ethics. So we have the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and in there it says, a realtor shall never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And we have similar language for the Code of Ethics for the California Real Estate Association. So we can see where kind of this influence comes. So there's a new book by Gene Slater, Freedom to Discriminate, where he speaks about the invention of the word realtor. So in the 1920s, real estate agents actually had a really bad reputation for getting people out of their properties and kind of scamming them, right? So they invented this word, the realtor. And the difference was that the realtor had a code of ethics. They had the underwriting manual. They professionalized it, but they also wrote these race restrictions, right? So the question is it truly ethics, is what I asked. So the racial restriction that I showed you for Bakersfield, the reason I have one quote is because it's used very commonly in Bakersfield and in Kern County. So in all of Kern County, we have about 171 motorized tracks. Tracks are entire neighborhoods. Those aren't just individual homes. So this is the map for Bakersfield. So here we have the Mayflower neighborhood that Eileen spoke about. And here's like the mall. Bakersfield College is moved by 1956 to the East Bakersfield. But we can see kind of the racial demographics of what's going on in Bakersfield. This is Oilville as well. And then again, I'll show you an interactive map that we've built where you can explore neighborhoods. So in 1948, there's a Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer. The case outlines that you cannot use racially restrictive covenants. We can't use courts to enforce racially restrictive covenants. It's not that you can't actually write that language. It's just you couldn't say, hey, I have that language. Someone wants to live there. We can use the courts to get them out, right? So I have some colleagues in part of the national group coalition that's looking at racially restrictive covenants. And so my colleagues have found this language up until the 1960s. So I think for some places, you see it more often, but in Bakersfield, it actually ends in 1950. And that's when the FHA actually reinforces the decision by saying that they will no longer finance homes that have racial restrictions, right? And I think that's why Bakersfield loses the language in 1950, because there's a drop. We don't see them again, but from other colleagues and some that actually found later, these racially restrictive, these covenants start using terms of harmony, right? Well, if the home is in harmony with the neighborhood. So that's something that others have been looking at as a term of racial harmony and how they use that to exclude other people. So the question is, with all these race restrictions, how did the racial minorities buy? So they bought on this system called buying on contract, which is a rent to own. And as Gabe said, that you have to pass a certain amount of down payment, right? So in these contracts, what we see is that people bought from real estate agents, and it wasn't until they passed the very high down payment that the real estate agent would take it to the Hall of Records to be notarized. So this is actually a contract by John Wilburn. He is the founder of the St. John's Baptist Church on Brundage. We actually met with his grandson, and he was able to identify that for us. So there's something pivotal that happens in Bakersfield during the 1950s, and it's the 1952 earthquake, and that's where we see some of the parallels with the removing of the Chinatown during that time. And Bakersfield undergoes an earthquake that really transforms downtown. So what makes it kind of unique from other cities is that Bakersfield gets the opportunity to reimagine its downtown. Other cities move to other downtowns. So some places you show up and you're like, oh, they have a beautiful historic downtown and a brand new downtown. Bakersfield doesn't have that because of the earthquake. So we see here, and under that advertising platform, they rebranded it America's Newest City, and today now it's the sound of something better. So, and here we actually see that Mayflower is actually right there, and it's not on the map. It's almost as if it didn't exist, right? It's actually behind the advertisement. And this is just some of the kind of articles that they ran during that time, and later on how they remembered the earthquake. Bakersfield College has moved to the east side. They rebuilt a lot of homes, a core building. We have some churches, and we advertise Bakersfield a comfortable place to live. And this is a stark reality. We're seeing some of the reports saying fight the opposite for communities of color. And in here, I remember 10 years later, the then mayor Mayor Frank Sullivan, he remembers it as an act of God that they're able to remodel. So here's a list, and this isn't the complete list, but it's a very big list of buildings and places that were kind of remodeled or created during that time. So you have City Hall, Mercy Hospital, we see a number of churches, the core building, the jail garage, the library, art and auditorium. It's a very transformative time. They also create Lake Isabella as a boating lake and Lake Maine as well. And you can see here the advertisements. The street scene is modern. So now I'm going to get into eminent domain. And here I'll play an excerpt by one of our oral histories at the HRC by Christina McClanahan, which she speaks about. eminent domain and being moved for the highway, the 58.
The 1954 Supreme Court decision came in, and a lot of things, many things, opened up for black people. But it was also a progressive thing, it's something you had to keep working on. The reason I thought about that is when we was looking at this house, when we lived up on Madison Street, and the state bought our house for the freeway, and we thought we'd just go out, and it was 1960 by then, we thought we'd just go out and buy a house, but I went out and I just couldn't, there just wasn't a house for me. And my husband, finally, they were building a new house, and I had been over there looking at it. And I think my husband must have mentioned something about, at that time, we could sue, So his boss called him in and told him that he could not sue. If he did, he wouldn't have a job.
Some of these things we can see that the boundaries are just more than just real estate agents. In this case, the boss calls her husband and says that he would lose his job if he sued. Okay, so now I'm going to go a little bit into the present. So something that future historians will probably end up looking at is the building of the Centennial Corridor, which is extending the 58 to the I-5. And some reports have estimated that about 300 homes were destroyed and about 900 were displaced. So the question is, who was being displaced? And now those are more older neighborhoods, more affordable neighborhoods, and those tend to be the most vulnerable whenever they come in and they take out homes. So we do have some restorative justice. Recently, there was a bill passed, Bill 1466, which allows homeowners that live in neighborhoods with racial restrictive covenants that they can actually go and redact that language. So if you live in a neighborhood that you would like to redact, please let me know. I have a lot of the neighborhood data, and I can point you to a document number, and you can go to the Hall of Records and start that process. So. And then also last year, the California Association of Realtors, they apologized for their role in racial segregation, and they supported the legislation that redacted racially restrictive covenants. But as far as their apology, it goes very briefly. It's just basically we're sorry for our involvement in racial segregation, but that's where it stops. So I think it's a continuing discussion of why we should keep on doing these presentations, why we should have more information on racially restrictive practices of the past. Because they didn't issue a report, it was just kind of a blanket apology. It's okay, so I'd like to thank you. If you have any questions, please email us at archives@csu.edu. We have our archive number, and then if you'd like to take your survey. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Donato. Really intriguing talks about some pretty disturbing discrimination and some contesting of that discrimination as well. So if we can have our three panelists up here, I'd be happy to direct questions to them if you have any.
Gabe, I know we worked with you to get you started on some of the sources, which we don't have much in the HRC. Could you speak to some of the difficulties because you've actually been pretty successful in tracking down primary sources, so I commend you for that. Could you kind of share that experience?
So when it comes to looking at these sources, it is pretty difficult. And a lot of these materials I'm trying to get a hold of or trying to look at are from the 1800s, early 1900s. So a lot of them that we do need would be in the local history room, which has been closed for the whole duration of my research so far. So I've had to look outside of that and try to find sources elsewhere. The Kern County Museum, I've gotten some good ones. That's where I got that labor contract from. And just to kind of show how difficult it is to find these specific ones on the Chinese community. That was just in a shot in the dark in a file that I asked to be pulled called Unique Documents from 1850 to 1900. So a lot of the time there's difficulties in researching this because I have to just kind of go by looking into Kern County Land Company's records or the records of these companies or different things and just try to find the language that would show or point towards the Chinese community in general.
Anybody else? I have a kind of basic question, and it's really born out of curiosity. How did each of you get interested in a particular topic that you've now spent an awful lot of time researching to our benefit?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. So, I mean, I grew up in Bakersfield, and during my whole time here, I had heard very little of the Chinese community and the Chinese community's history here. But I've heard so many other stories about Bakersfield's history. So once I saw a few things about it and I started doing a little bit of research, I realized that there's a much bigger story that has been largely ignored in the way that we've remembered the Chinese community, and even just going down to visit the areas where there's existing structures or public monuments or anything like that. You see China Alley, which is not in the best condition. Or if you go up to the Hitachi Loop, there's a little monument thing that is from 1950 that is just commemorating the railroad coming through and stuff like that. And then not until there's the 1950 monument, and there's one that's made within the past couple decades that then finally made mention just in one sentence that says 3,000 Chinese laborers worked on this. So you can just kind of see the disconnect of how these individuals are being remembered in the history.
Honestly, it was from listening to Donato that I got into it, because his research also focuses on the Sunset Mayflower district. But what I don't remember who told me, but it was basically find something that pisses you off and research it. And during that time, there was a lot of police violence going on. This was 2020 with Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. My research started as an inquiry into policing. Then it slowly came into what it is now, which is, looking at the Sunset Mayflower district. Less so on housing. It is a big component, but more on people and how they try to push past all those challenges and advocate for themselves. And they weren't going to get any help from the city, the county, as much as they tried, so they organized and got through it together. I mean, like I said, it's not perfect. There's still lots of work to be done, but there are community organizations still out there, and there are, I work with the Dolores Special Foundation, so I know the community organization side of it now. I didn't when I started my research, but now it's getting more into it. But yeah, it was really just kind of focusing on something that made me angry and talking about it, and kind of what Gabe said is trying not to get focus on the people who were mentioned in the little footnote and making a larger narrative of it.
So mine has changed quite a bit. But it really starts with Chris. Chris received a collection, the Claude Logic collection. And from the story he tells me, it's a story it was a collection that was going to be thrown away, and he was basically the last person to see it. He was either going to accept it or not. And he saw a small word that said Mayflower, and he was like, I'm going to take it just based on one word. And I started processing it when I was a student assistant. And I wrote a term paper on it with my mentor, Dr. Marie Stengel, who has left another university. And she was like, if you want this to be a master's thesis, I think this paper can do it. And that's what it became, right? So, and it's had different motivations over time. I think those were my initial motivations. I'm going to show some of the maps real quick. So, I'm actually pretty familiar with that neighborhood. My uncle lives there, and I spent a lot of my childhood visiting my cousins in those neighborhoods. So, yeah. Sorry.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So my uncle lives right around this area. So I was familiar with going into those neighborhoods. I guess I'll show my way, but I'm very familiar. My uncle lives right here. So as a kid, we'd take the bus and we'd drive down. So I'm very familiar with the area. And later on, I started into more research. Chris was asking me, he's like, hey, you've been doing a lot of research on restrictive covenants. My parents still live in this neighborhood, this like sliver here. And he was like, oh, did they have restrictive covenants because their home's from the 50s? And what I can tell is that our neighborhood was built in conjunction to this tract, but it was after that tract was founded. But this tract does have racially restrictive covenants. So it was interesting to think about myself in that space and how much that neighborhood has changed over time. But this is a primarily Hispanic neighborhood now. We moved in, it was only 2 Hispanic families, now there's only 2 white families. So it's interesting also to think about myself as someone who doesn't fit the description of that racially restrictive covenant. So, but things have changed over time, and this was actually for a conference for a geography, kind of social justice conference with Jesus Garcia, who initially started to help me do these maps, and now we're going to move it forward with a grant to go purchase the covenants. So there's a lot of motivations for a lot of the research has changed significantly and evolved as time has gone.
Any others? Okay, Chris, did you want everyone to take the survey who attended? Or just
Yeah, everybody, yeah,
Okay, why don't you put the survey back up?
if you can.
So I want to thank our speakers and for everyone participating here and joining them today. And keep your eye out because next semester we'll have a continuation of this series as well. I'm glad you're serving. Thank you so much for